Blood has a smell that doesn't wash out. Not really. You can scrub your hands until the skin cracks, flood the sink with scalding water and institutional soap that strips the oil from your knuckles, and you'll still catch it hours later, hiding in the creases of your palms. Copper and iron, and something older than both. Marcus Webb knew this the way he knew his own heartbeat. Intimately, involuntarily, every single shift. The fluorescent lights above the nurses' station at Jefferson Memorial's emergency department cast everyone in the same shade of exhausted yellow. It was 3:14 in the morning on a Wednesday, the kind of hour that exists in a different time zone from the rest of the world. Marcus stood at the supply cart outside Bay 4, counting gauze pads with the methodical patience of a man who had learned, slowly and with great personal cost, how to exist at half speed. He was a large man, not in the casual sense, the kind of large that made door frames feel approximate and exam gloves perpetually insufficient. 6'3", broad across the shoulders in a way that his oversized navy scrubs only partially concealed. He moved with a heaviness that the day shift nurses had long since labeled as slow, plodding. They used the word gentle the way people use it when they mean something else entirely. Marcus let them. "Webb." The voice came from the end of the corridor. "Dr. Craig Pearce, Chief of Surgery." A man who wore his medical degree like a second skeleton, visible beneath everything else he did. He appeared at the threshold with a tablet tucked under his arm, and the particular impatience of someone who had never stood in line for anything in his life. "The isolation cart for Bay 7 is still half-stocked," Pearce said, not looking up from his tablet. "I need it complete before my 0400 rounds, and when you're done with that, the on-call resident is struggling with a difficult stick in Bay 2. Go assist." He finally looked up, his eyes landing somewhere in the vicinity of Marcus's chest rather than his face. "That's a better use of your time than standing in the hallway counting things." "Bay 7 is done, Dr. Pearce," Marcus replied. His voice was low, flat, and unhurried. "I restocked it at the start of shift. Top 2 drawers." Pearce made a sound in the back of his throat. Not acknowledgement, not apology, just the sound of a man recalibrating his irritation into a different shape. His footsteps receded down the hall. Marcus pressed the supply drawer shut and dried his hands on a paper towel. He wasn't slow. He had never been slow. Speed was a decision, and he had made a different one 3 years ago, on the day he walked into Jefferson Memorial and filled out his nursing application with a hand that still occasionally trembled from nerve damage he had never officially reported to anyone. He had decided, standing in that HR office with its motivational posters and its carpet that smelled like old coffee, that he was going to exist at the speed of the people around him. Not because he couldn't move faster, because moving faster drew questions, and questions were the enemy of the one thing Marcus Webb needed more than oxygen: invisibility. He had spent 11 years in the most visible position imaginable, first as an 18 Delta, a Special Forces medical sergeant attached to 1st SFOD Delta, then as the task force's primary trauma asset in 3 combat theaters, running into places that didn't appear on any map, keeping men alive by methods that had no civilian equivalent and no proper name. He had a call sign, Reaper, which the unit had given him not for his lethality, but for his habit of dragging people back from the edge of death in conditions that should have made survival statistically impossible. He had buried all of that, packed it into a box, and driven the box into the ground with both hands. Now he stocked carts. He drew blood on difficult veins with an accuracy that made residents blink and forget to ask where he'd learned it. He changed dressings with a precision that bordered on unsettling, and he went home at 0700 and drank exactly 1 cup of coffee and did not check the news. It was a quiet life, a manageable life. He had almost convinced himself it was enough. The sensation didn't begin in his ears. It began in the soles of his boots. It was 0238. Marcus was at the nurses' station, completing his charting on a patient in Bay 6, when the building shifted beneath him. Not dramatically, Not the kind of shift that civilians registered. It was a subsonic tremor, deep and rhythmic, moving through the concrete pillars from somewhere outside, up through the floor, into the bones of his feet before his conscious mind had formed an opinion about what it was. Thump, 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 thump. He went very still. His fingers stopped over the keyboard. Sandra, the charge nurse, was 2 feet to his left, arguing with the pharmacy over a delayed antibiotic order. She didn't feel it. The drunk in the waiting room was snoring. The PA system hissed softly. Everything in the room continued at its normal frequency, except for Marcus, who had stopped being a man counting gauze pads and had become something else entirely, without quite deciding to. Thump, thump, thump. He swiveled slowly in his chair. Not a civilian medevac. The frequency was wrong. Civilian life flight birds were lighter, higher-pitched, fast and nervous. This sound was a deep, industrial percussion, the sound of something massive and deliberate displacing a serious amount of air. The part of his brain that he had been trying to medicate into dormancy for 3 years identified it before the rest of him could intervene. MH-60 Blackhawk, fully loaded, moving at approach speed. More than one. He stood up, walked to the window at the far end of the corridor. His hands were in his scrub pockets. He could feel them, down at the bottom of the fabric, his fingers curled into loose fists. Through the rain-streaked glass, the parking lot below was lit in amber sodium light. Nothing. Then the trees along the perimeter fence began to lean, all in the same direction, bending hard away from something enormous coming in from the north. 2 MH-60s cleared the tree line. No running lights. Night vision configured. They flared over the north parking lot with the aggressive authority of aircraft that had never once asked permission to land anywhere. The red emergency phone at the charge desk rang. Sandra dropped her pharmacy argument mid-sentence. She picked up the red phone with the expression of a woman who had never once wanted it to ring. Jefferson Memorial emergency. A pause. Her face changed. "I'm sorry. How many?" "Sir, we're a level 2 trauma center. We don't have the surgical teams on standby to handle." Another pause, longer. "You cannot just—" She stopped. Whoever was on the other end wasn't asking. "Code yellow," Sandra called out, her voice 3 octaves higher than its normal register. "Code yellow, everyone. Incoming military transport, north lot. Clear the ambulance bay." The ER fractured into the specific chaos of a civilian medical staff encountering something entirely outside the scope of their training. Residents jogged in wrong directions. 2 nurses collided near the crash cart, pulling it in opposite directions. Dr. Pearce materialized from somewhere, his voice cutting through the noise with the practiced authority of a man trying to reassert ownership over a situation that had already moved past him. "We need the administrator on call," Pearce was saying. "Someone contact the VA liaison. This is completely outside our operational mandate." Marcus stood at the window. He was very still. He felt the old, familiar cold spreading through his chest. Not fear. He hadn't experienced fear in the conventional sense since 2017. It was something older and more specific. The cold of a man who recognizes the sound of his previous life approaching at low altitude with its lights off. The ambulance bay doors burst open. Not slid, not swung. Burst, as if the doors had been informed that a courteous entrance was no longer among the available options. 4 men came through fast and hard in a tight combat stack. Multicam plate carriers. Helmets with night vision mounts flipped up. They were soaking wet from the rain and coated in a fine reddish dust that didn't come from anywhere near Jefferson Memorial. One of them had blood on his hands that wasn't his own. They were carrying a Skedco litter between them at the half-run, the legs of the man on the stretcher bouncing with each step. The man at the front of the stack was the one Marcus saw first. He was tall, wide through the chest, a sergeant's posture in every line of his body. Dark beard, jaw set like poured concrete. He swept the room with the automated threat assessment of a man who had cleared 1,000 rooms in the dark, and he dismissed every civilian in the ER in under 2 seconds. "Move," the tall one ordered. His voice didn't have to be loud. It had the weight of a thing that had never needed to repeat itself. The crowd parted. They moved the litter toward the open bay. Marcus was standing at the far end of the corridor with his back against the wall. He stayed there. He could read the situation from 40 feet away. He had been trained to read it at twice that distance, in zero illumination, while taking fire. Male patient, early 30s. Tracheal deviation to the right. Paradoxical chest movement on the left side. The blue-gray tint beginning at his lips, spreading into his nail beds. The tourniquet on his right thigh had been applied correctly. Excellent technique. But the discoloration above and below it told Marcus it had been on too long. He gave him 8 minutes, maybe less. Dr. Pearce arrived at the bay with 2 residents flanking him and reached immediately for his stethoscope. "Penetrating chest trauma, possible pneumothorax," he announced. "I want a portable chest x-ray, Page thoracic surgery on call, and someone needs to explain to me why." The tall soldier stepped directly into Pearce's path. He was significantly larger than the surgeon in every dimension. "Step back," he said simply. Pearce blinked. "I am the chief of surgery at this facility, and I will not be ordered around in my own. You just called for an x-ray on a man with a tension pneumothorax." The soldier's voice was flat. Absolutely flat. The flatness of a man who had run out of patience for this category of problem somewhere around his 3rd deployment. "By the time your imaging comes back, I'll be writing a name on the wall. Stand down." Pearce sputtered. The soldier turned his back on him. He turned to the assembled nurses and residents frozen at the threshold of the bay. He scanned them one by one with eyes that were dark and deeply exhausted, and entirely without warmth. He moved from face to face with the methodical precision of a man checking boxes. "Where is he?" the soldier said. Sandra stepped forward, clutching her tablet. "Sir, if you can give us the patient's full name and unit designation, we can contact the military liaison and—" "I'm not looking for your liaison." He let the words settle. Around them, the man on the litter made a sound. It was a wet, terrible rattling sound. The sound of a chest that was losing the argument it was trying to have with physics. The soldier's jaw tightened. "I'm looking for a nurse. Name on the civilian license is Webb. Marcus Webb." A pause. "But his name isn't Marcus Webb. Not to us." He raised his voice just enough to reach the corners of the room. "I'm looking for Reaper." The name hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt it in his chest, like a struck bell. He pressed his back harder against the wall. His hands were no longer in his pockets. They were at his sides, perfectly still, held there with the deliberate effort of a man performing stillness from the outside in. No. The word had no volume. It existed entirely inside him, a stone dropped into still water. He had buried that name. He had buried it deep, and he had been careful, meticulous. 3 full years of careful. And now it was in a civilian emergency room, under fluorescent lights, being said aloud by a man covered in someone else's blood. On the litter, Ajax seized. His back arched violently off the canvas. The bubbling in his chest worsened, becoming a strangled, rhythmic sucking. The pulse oximeter that one of the nurses had managed to clip to his finger began to alarm, the tone long and continuous and terrible. One of the soldiers holding pressure on the thigh wound looked up. He was young beneath the mud. His eyes had gone wild in the specific way that trained soldiers' eyes go wild only when there is nothing left to reach for. "Sarge," the young soldier said. His voice cracked at the seam. "Ajax is crashing. Trachea's shifted. He's out of time." The tall soldier, the one who had asked for Reaper, moved to the bed. He was capable. He was trained in battlefield medicine at a level that made the residents look like they were playing with toy stethoscopes. But he was not a medic, and he knew it, and the knowledge was written in every line of his face, in a language that Marcus could read perfectly. He turned in a slow circle. He looked at every person in the room. "Reaper," he said the name once more, quietly. Not loud, not desperate. the tone of a man filing his last available option. "I know you're in this building. Ajax is out of time." Marcus looked at his hands. They had stopped shaking. They always stopped when it mattered. That was the thing he had never been able to fix about himself. The tremor that plagued him in the quiet hours, in the break room, in the parking garage at 0700, vanished completely in the presence of the one thing that needed it to be gone. Muscle memory didn't respect the life you were trying to build. It only respected the work. He looked at the man on the litter. He saw the tracheal deviation, the cyanosis spreading from the lips into the nail beds, the left chest moving in the wrong direction with each increasingly shallow breath. He looked at Dr. Pearce, standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his jaw set, waiting for someone to acknowledge that his portable chest X-ray was a good idea. The alarm on the monitor stretched into a continuous, unbroken scream. Marcus pushed off the wall. He didn't run, he walked. But the quality of the walk had changed entirely in the space of 4 steps, and what had replaced the deliberate half-speed shuffle was something that made Sandra instinctively take a step back when he passed her. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't haste, it was the particular quality of a body that has been given permission to stop pretending. He walked into Bay 4 and stopped at the foot of the litter. The tall soldier turned. He looked at Marcus. He took in the oversized Navy scrubs, the hospital ID badge, the face he hadn't seen in 6 years, except in the old photographs his unit kept in a folder nobody talked about. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You cut your hair," the soldier said quietly. "You got gray in yours," Marcus replied. "Captain Daniel Torres, 1st SFAD Delta." Marcus had last seen him bleeding from a through-and-through wound in his left shoulder in a courtyard in Mosul, being loaded onto an extraction bird, while Marcus was still on the ground managing 2 other casualties. That had been the last night Marcus Webb had existed as Reaper. The next morning he had begun the long, patient process of becoming a man who counted gauze pads and went home at 0700. "Step back, Torres," Marcus said. Torres stepped back. It was instantaneous. The movement of a soldier whose nervous system had spent years training itself to respond to a specific set of voices. He stepped back, and he stayed back. Dr. Pearce moved forward from the foot of the bed. "Now just a moment. This individual does not have surgical privileges at this facility, and I will not stand here while an uncredentialed." "Dr. Pearce." Marcus did not raise his voice. He had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard by the right people. He looked at the surgeon with a flatness that contained no contempt and no deference, and no performance of any kind. Just information. "Step to the left. If this man dies because you needed someone to validate your authority, that's a weight you'll carry. That's your business. My business is the next 6 minutes." He looked at Sandra. "Sandra, 14-gauge angiocath. Now, chest tube tray, 36 French. Skip the betadine, skip the lidocaine. 2 large bore IVs, antecubital if they'll cooperate. External jugular if they won't. O negative, 2 units, squeeze them in." Sandra stood completely still. She was looking at Marcus the way you look at a thing you have been seeing every day for 3 years and are only now actually seeing for the first time. "Sandra," his voice was quiet. "Absolute. Please move." She moved. Marcus snapped on gloves. He leaned over the man on the litter, Ajax, and he stopped thinking about the name because names were a weight he couldn't afford in the next 6 minutes. He put 2 fingers on the chest. Second intercostal space, right side, mid-clavicular line. He found it. He confirmed what he already knew. The tension pneumothorax had fully developed. Air trapped in the pleural cavity compressing the heart degree by degree, pushing the mediastinum to the right, shutting everything down from the inside. Behind him, Pearce was speaking in the controlled, tight register of a man constructing a formal objection for the record. "The liability exposure alone is, this is completely outside any recognized scope of practice for a registered nurse. I cannot be responsible for." "Dr. Pearce," Torres said softly, from the corner of the room. "Just the name. 2 words." Pearce stopped. Sandra returned at something between a walk and a run, the angiocath in her outstretched hand. She thrust it toward Marcus without ceremony. The expression on her face was something he had never put there in 3 years. It was not the careful tolerance of a charge nurse managing a workflow problem. It was pure, undiluted attention. "Hold him," Marcus told the operator nearest the head of the litter. "Both shoulders. Dead still." The operator braced. Marcus did not count down. He did not announce the procedure. He placed 2 fingers on the chest wall, confirmed the landmark, angled the needle, and drove the 14-gauge straight into the pleural space between the second and third ribs. The release was immediate and violent. A rush of pressurized air exploded through the catheter with a hiss that filled the bay, followed by a fine mist of aerated blood that caught the light as it sprayed the front of Marcus's scrubs in a thin crimson line. The trachea, visible in the hollow of Ajax's throat, shifted, slowly, back toward center. On the monitor, the long continuous alarm began to soften. "Pressure's climbing," said one of the operators who had positioned himself at the monitor with the quiet competence of a man who knew exactly how to read one. "It's a bridge." Marcus was already opening the chest tube tray, his bloody gloves moving with an economy of motion that had no wasted component. "Not a fix. The lung is still down. There's a hemothorax building in the pleural space, and if we don't drain it before it reaccumulates, he'll tension again in under 10 minutes. He looked at Sandra without looking up. "I need you to assist. Can you do that?" Sandra had been a charge nurse for 14 years. She had seen a great many things come through the ambulance bay doors. She had never seen anything quite like the last 4 minutes. She looked at Marcus. "Tell me exactly what you need," she said steadily. He told her. The chest tube took 4 minutes. It was an ugly procedure, the way it always is, the way it has to be when there is no time to be anything other than effective. A scalpel incision along the 5th intercostal space. A curved Kelly forceps spread brutally through the intercostal muscle. A gloved finger pushed into the pleural space to sweep the clotted blood away from the insertion site. The tube driven in deep and connected to the suction unit that Sandra had ready and waiting before he asked. The machine gurgled to life, and dark blood began moving through the clear plastic tubing in thick, rhythmic pulses, draining from the chest cavity with a sound that was deeply wrong and deeply right at the same time. On the monitor, the erratic spiking resolved. Slowly, like a radio finding its frequency. Beep, beep, beep. Ajax's chest rose, both sides, in unison. The blue receded from his lips. Marcus stepped back. He stripped his gloves. He pressed both hands flat on the edge of the supply cart, locking his elbows, holding himself upright. The familiar crash was coming, the adrenaline receding like a tide going out, leaving behind the exhaustion and the ache and the smell of copper that was never going to wash out of his sinuses. He became aware of the silence. The entire night shift of Jefferson Memorial Emergency Department was standing at the threshold of Bay 4. Residents, nurses, the housekeeping staff who had been mopping the corridor, all of them completely still, watching him. Pearce was against the back wall. He was very quiet. There was something in his expression that Marcus had never put there before in 3 years of being told to stalk the cart and go assist the intern and stay out of the way. Torres appeared at Marcus's elbow. The captain looked at Ajax, breathing, stable, the monitor singing its careful rhythm. He looked at Marcus. The muscle in his jaw moved. 6 years of something moved through his eyes and settled. "You need to get him to thoracic surgery," Marcus said before Torres could speak. "The tube is managing the hemothorax, but it needs to be properly evacuated and the lung re-expanded under direct visualization. The tourniquet on his thigh has been on too long. The vascular team needs to assess for reperfusion injury before anyone takes it down. If they rush it, they'll kill him as efficiently as the pneumothorax would have." "Marcus, get him upstairs, Torres." A long pause. The monitor beeped, the suction unit gurgled. "We've been looking for you," Torres said softly. Not as an accusation. As a fact he had been carrying for a long time. "I know," Marcus said. Torres looked at the scrubs, at the hospital ID badge clipped to the chest pocket, at the supply cart with its neat rows of gauze and IV supplies. "You've been here the whole time." "Someone had to be," Marcus said. He turned. He walked out of Bay 4 and through the gathered staff of Jefferson Memorial, who parted for him without being asked. He walked past Dr. Pearce, who said nothing. He walked past the crash cart and the overflowing biohazard bins and the wet footprints the operators had left across the linoleum. He walked to the nurse's station and sat down in the chair in front of the charting computer and pulled up the incident report form. Behind him, he heard the trauma team mobilizing to move Ajax upstairs. Torres's voice on his radio, low and efficient. The young operator with the wild eyes saying something to one of the nurses that he couldn't quite make out. The sound of the litter wheels, the squeak of running shoes, the organized, controlled sound of a crisis that had been pulled back from the edge and was now being properly managed. He heard Sandra, very quietly, asking Dr. Pearce if he still wanted her to order the portable chest X-ray. He did not hear Pearce respond. After a while, Sandra appeared beside his chair. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, and then she set a coffee cup on the desk next to his keyboard. Not from the carafe. The good coffee, from the physician lounge, still hot. Marcus picked it up. He drank it slowly, looking at the screen. "Who were you?" Sandra asked. Her voice was careful in the way that voices get when someone is choosing words with unusual precision. "Before." Marcus looked at the incident report form. The cursor blinked in the empty field. "Night shift nurse," he said. "Bay assignments 2 through 6. He placed his fingers on the keys. "The patient in Bay 3 needs his dressing changed at 0400. Will you put a reminder in?" Sandra was quiet for a long time. "Sure," she said finally. "I'll put it in." She walked away. Her footsteps faded. Marcus started typing. Through the ambulance bay windows, he heard the Blackhawks beginning to spool up. The sound built from a deep subsonic tremor to a full-throated roar that rattled the pushpins on the staff bulletin board above his head and made the water tremble in the cup Sandra had left beside his keyboard. The rotor wash shook the glass in its frames. Then the sound began to climb, banking north, rising above the tree line, carrying Ajax toward the surgical suite and Torres toward wherever Torres was always going next. The sound receded, diminished, dissolved. What was left behind was the ordinary hum of the fluorescent lights above the nurse's station at Jefferson Memorial Emergency Department at 3 in the morning on a Wednesday. Marcus kept typing. He had a lot of dressings to change before dawn. If you found yourself holding your breath in that trauma bay, you already know why this channel exists. The most extraordinary people are usually the ones nobody thinks to look at twice. Subscribe for more stories about the men and women who carry the weight of who they used to be in silence, showing up every shift to save the people who will never know what they're really looking at. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and leave a comment below. What did you think Marcus was going to do when Torres said his name? Stay tuned.